Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This lecture is intended for students enrolled in the Academy's Classical Ethics course. If you're not enrolled and would like to join us for self-paced studies, please visit classicalliberalarts.com. My name is William Michael. I'm the Academy Headmaster, and I'll be leading this study. In this lesson, we're going to study Chapter 2 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle was the most famous and influential Greek philosopher who lived from 384 to 322 BC. 384 to 322 BC. He wrote this work, the Nicomachean Ethics, around 350 BC as a systematic or philosophical investigation into human character and, most importantly, the path to true happiness. Quite an important study. How can we be happy? The Nicomachean Ethics seeks to answer the fundamental question of how human beings should live. And it provides us with a really incredible amount of practical wisdom for growing in virtue and avoiding vices, and also how to flourish in community with others. So it doesn't teach a monastic morality, a morality for one's individual life. It really addresses the question of how we can live in such a way that allows all men to prosper and enjoy happiness. This second chapter establishes the foundation for Aristotle's entire inquiry into ethics by proving that the highest good or the chief end must be the object of political science, which, speaking of political science, serves as the master science that governs all other practical disciplines. This text, the Ethics here, became foundational to Catholic moral theology because of the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was able to recognize in the 13th century Aristotle's philosophy as a framework that was perfectly suited to the Christian understanding of human nature, of natural law, of the common good, and of the divine ordering of political authority towards human salvation. So as we go through Chapter 2, we're going to really focus on Aristotle's answer to the question, what is the key? What is the master science of all sciences? What is the chief end? And how ought we to pursue it? A most important study, of course. But before we get into the lesson, let's take a moment and commit this time to the Lord and ask Him to bless our studies. Let us pray. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your Spirit upon us and fill us with your wisdom and blessings. Grant that we may devote ourselves to our studies and draw ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, you are the patron saint of all Catholic students. Please pray for us. Now at this point, we're going to get into the division of the lesson, but before we do that, you need to make your first reading of the lesson text. So you need to read chapter 2 of book 1 for yourself. If you haven't already done that, you need to pause this lecture, go and read the lesson for yourself, and then pick up where you leave off. If you have already read the lesson for yourself, then we can continue into the division. But seriously, you should read through the lesson from beginning to end before getting into the real content of this lecture. So please do that and then come back and continue. As for the division, we're going to divide chapter 2 into four significant parts. Aristotle constructs this chapter as a philosophical proof. And what he wants to prove in this lesson is that political science is the master science, or the architectonic science, which studies the highest good. So he does this, he proves this with a four-part argument. And this makes up the 4 parts of chapter 2. So the first part begins at the opening of the chapter, where we read, "If therefore there is a certain end of action," and we'll title this first part, "The Logical Necessity of a Final End." The logical necessity of a final end. Aristotle proves at the beginning of this chapter that there must be some highest or some final end which directs all of the human life. There must be. It's a logical necessity. He uses a method of arguing that's called reductio ad absurdum, or a reduction to absurdity, which is a kind of indirect proof. He reasons to prove that human action, in order for human action, rational human action, in order for it to have any purpose at all, there must be some ultimate end that is desired for its own sake. There must be some ultimate end that is desired for its own sake. When we realize that man is a rational creature, when we realize that there is a hierarchy of ends in the world, it is logically necessary that man must be able to discover and know the ultimate end, or the highest good, that he may order his entire life towards that highest good. So that's the first part of this chapter. Aristotle simply proves that the knowledge of a final end is necessary for man. The second part of the lesson begins where we read, "Will not therefore the knowledge of this end," and so on. So in this second part, having proven that there must be a final end of the human life, Aristotle argues the practical necessity for the knowledge of that end. So in the first part, he argues for the logical necessity of a final end. Here he shows that there is a practical necessity for the knowledge of a final end. He proves by the use of an analogy that knowledge of the ultimate good is essential for man to be able to live rightly, or to live well. And he uses a famous comparison to archery. He says that an archer can't possibly shoot any arrows if he doesn't know the target. He has to have a target to aim at in order to shoot his arrows. And in the same way, man must have a final end as the target of all of his actions. So he compares moral philosophy with the science of archery, and says that the knowledge of the final end is like the knowledge of an archer's target. So that's part 2, where Aristotle argues of the practical necessity of knowing the final end. Part 3 begins where we read, "But it would seem that it belongs to that power and so on. But it would seem. In this third part, Aristotle argues that political science is the master science. Political science is the master or architectonic science. He identifies political science, and we have to be careful not to confuse political science with anything that we might think political science signifies in modern society. Remember, Aristotle is writing over 2,300 years ago in ancient Greece, sometime around 350 BC. When he uses this term political science, he has a very specific idea in mind, and he explains what he means by it in this second chapter. So as we go through the interpretation, we'll make sure that we clearly define Aristotle's idea of political science. He identifies political science as the master discipline. He says that it's this study, political science, that studies the final end of human life. And he shows how political science governs or directs all other practical sciences. So this is the master science. That's part 3. And then in part 4 begins where we read, "For though the good of an individual and a city is the same." Part 4, we study the supremacy of the common good. And this is a very important concept. Often when we hear men talking about philosophy, they use it as sort of a self-help study. They may study Stoicism, for example, to try to understand how to improve their lives or how to be more happy as an individual. But Aristotle argues that that's really not the goal of philosophy. The goal of philosophy, or we should say the source of happiness, the highest good of the human life, is not for an individual to be happy. That's not the highest good. The highest good is for all men to be happy. For all men to be happy. And this idea of the common good, the happiness of all men, Aristotle shows that this really must be the chief end that we all seek. So he establishes the priority of the common good over individual good, and this, he says, proves that political science, which seeks to know and promote the common good, must be the highest of all practical sciences. So those are the 4 parts into which we're going to divide chapter 2. Just as a quick review, part 1 shows the logical necessity of a final end. Part 2 shows the practical necessity of a final end. Part 3 shows that political science is that master science. And part 4 demonstrates the supremacy of the common good. So having divided the text now, hopefully you can make a mark in the text where these different parts begin and end. What we need to do now is go through the interpretation and read through the entire text and make sure that everything is as clear as possible. Remember, if there's anything that you read in the text that you don't understand and you feel is not explained or is not covered in the lecture, please get in touch with me. I'm happy to help you with any details, but you just need to let me know what it is that you'd like some help with, or if there's something that you find to be unclear. So let's work through this whole text in chapter 2, and we'll seek to understand everything it contains and especially give attention to vocabulary, unfamiliar terms that we may run into as we study ethics. So the chapter 2 again, begins with the following. If, therefore, there is a certain end of action which we wish to obtain for its own sake, but we desire other things on account of this, and our choice is not directed to all things for the sake of something else, for thus there would be a progression to infinity, so that appetite would be empty and vain. If this be the case, it is evident that this end will be the good, and that which is the most excellent. So Aristotle begins chapter 2 here with a conditional argument that reveals the logical structure of human action. He makes a distinction here between intrinsic goods, things that are desired for their own sake, and instrumental goods. This is an important distinction. Intrinsic goods, things that are sought for their own sake, and instrumental goods, things that are sought as the means to obtain something else. So intrinsic and instrumental goods. His crucial insight on this subject is that if every good were merely instrumental, if every good were instrumental, that is, that there was no final good, but every good that existed was simply sought for something else, and that went on to infinity, he says that our desires, our appetite would then be empty and vain, because it would never, ever reach satisfaction. This is an example of an argument that uses the reduction of an opposing view to absurdity. He shows that the alternative view, that there is no final end, is just absurd. So he shows that meaningful human action requires at least one final end. I want to repeat that. If there is any meaningful human action, there must be at least one final end, and this is the good, or that which is most excellent. The alternative to that there is no final end, becomes just an absurd argument that makes everything meaningless. So he argues again, from that reduction to absurdity, this indirect argument to prove that there must be some ultimate end or chief end at which man can direct all of his actions. St. Thomas Aquinas recognized in this reasoning of Aristotle a natural foundation for understanding how human beings are ordered toward their ultimate end, which St. Thomas identified as God himself. So St. Thomas Aquinas embraced this Aristotelian teaching and this argument and said, Aristotle's right. Aristotle's right. There must be a final end at which all human action is directed. And St. Thomas explained, as I think Aristotle would agree, even though Aristotle lived 600 or 350 years before Christ, St. Thomas argued that this highest end is God himself. God is our ultimate end. So Aristotle continues, and we read, quote, "If this be the case, will not, therefore, the knowledge of this end be of great importance with respect to life? Will not the knowledge of this end, this final end, be of great importance with respect to life? For by having, like archers, a mark at which we may aim, we shall obtain what is fit in a greater degree." So after proving that there must be a highest or final good, Aristotle now demonstrates in this second part why knowing that highest good is practically essential, or is necessary for all practical life. This famous archery analogy that I mentioned before illustrates that just as archers need to have clear targets in order to shoot accurately, human beings need to understand their ultimate purpose in order to live well. Human beings need to know and understand their ultimate purpose in order to live well. Without this knowledge, we would lack any consistent direction and would not be able to make any good choices. In fact, the whole idea of a good choice wouldn't even have any meaning. It would make no sense. There would be no such thing as a good choice because there's no end. The phrase that we read, obtain what is fit, obtain what is fit, where Aristotle says, for by having a mark at which we may aim, we shall obtain what is fit in a greater degree. That phrase, obtain what is fit, means achieving what is appropriate or fitting to our nature. We would achieve or obtain what is fit or to be expected for rational creatures. This would be actions that align with the idea of human flourishing or ultimate human happiness. How would we be able to be happy? How would we be able as rational creatures to be satisfied and happy if there was not some final end, and not just any final end, but a final end that was actually worthy of our nature and able to satisfy us? And so for Aristotle, this practical focus, and we can see that though Aristotle may be difficult to study at sometimes, he is very, very practical. He makes practical arguments that we can all appreciate. And this practical emphasis shows Aristotle's conviction that ethics, the study of moral philosophy, is not some kind of abstract, speculative science, but it aims very practically at living well, actually being good men. That's the goal of the study of ethics. And there's no way that we could do that unless it's possible for us to know the highest good. So that, again, is the content of part 2. He goes on to write, quote, if this be the case, if there is some highest good that's necessary, if this be the case, we must endeavor to adumbrate what it is, and show to what science or power it belongs. If this is the case, we must endeavor to adumbrate what it is, and show to what science or power it belongs. So here Aristotle lays out his plan. This is what he wants to do. He wants to adumbrate what this highest good is and show to what science or power it belongs. This word adumbrate is usually new to students who are reading ethics. What it means is to make a sketch, to sketch something out. In other words, if let's say that there was a crime and detectives were trying to get started looking for a suspect for the crime, and there were some witnesses, no one would really have a clear, detailed sense of what the person looked like. They might not be able to explain exactly what his features were. And so they have an artist begin to sketch the image of the suspect, and they'll take different bits of information from different people. Maybe someone can guess at how tall he was. Someone can say what color his hair was. Someone might be able to define the shape of his face. All of this basic information, and the artist will simply start to put it together to create a rough sketch of the subject, at least so people can begin to look for the suspect and talk about who he might be. So that idea of sketching out some knowledge or sketching out some subject, that's what it means to adumbrate, to make a sketch of something. So Aristotle says that if there is a final end, we don't necessarily know what it is. What we need to do is create a sketch of it, at least make a sketch of it, adumbrate what it is. So in this, he acknowledges that fully understanding the highest good might not even be necessary. But what's required is that we pursue it with a kind of systematic investigation. And step one requires us to sketch it out, at least make a sketch of it. He seeks also to determine which science or power has the ability to study the ultimate good. How can we pursue this knowledge? What science will help us to succeed in this investigation? Different sciences study different aspects of reality, different subjects, according to their own proper objects and methods. The question that Aristotle asks is, which discipline, which field of study, or which science leads us to study and learn the good life as a whole? What science is there that actually is the science of happiness, as it were? He continues and says, quote, "It would seem that it belongs to that power which is the most principal and is especially architectonic. And the political power or science appears to be of this kind." So Aristotle reveals his hypothesis, as it were, his intelligent guess at the answer. He argues that it must be political science. So he identifies the science that studies the highest good, and he does so by pointing out two characteristics that this science would need to have, the two characteristics that allow us to identify this ultimate science. He says, first of all, he says, it must belong to that power which is most principal. That means it has the highest authority. And second, it must be especially architectonic. Architectonic, that means it must be the science that directs the other sciences, that governs other sciences, like a master builder directs all of the craftsmen. So whatever science this is, it must have these two qualities. It must be the most principal science, and it must be the most architectonic science. And as he thinks through this and investigates all of the different options, he identifies political science as the science that possesses these traits. As I mentioned before, when we hear the term political science, we may think of things from our own time, but we've got to understand this in a comprehensive way. We're not talking about modern political science, but the complete study of human community. By political science here, we mean the study or the science of the human community. And that study has to include the study of ethics, the study of political philosophy, the study of law or jurisprudence, and social theory, all united around promoting the human good or the happiness of all men. So when we say political science, we're not just talking about a college major where you go and study the basics of the Constitution, how the government works, how elections work, and things like that. We're talking about the study of human community, the study of human community. And that's very important for an obvious reason. Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas both taught that man is not only a rational animal, not only is man's nature rational and intelligent, but man is also a social animal. man is a social animal. He's designed to live in community. His life doesn't make sense in isolation or separate from community. Just think about the fact that we're the only animal species that is able to speak. The ability to speak proves that we are designed by nature to live in community with other speakers. We're designed to live in community with other men. So Aristotle argues that the only science that can claim to study the science of happiness, as it were, would be political science, because man is by nature a social or political animal. That's what man is. Aristotle goes on and says, quote, "For this," that is political science, "ordains what sciences ought to be instituted in cities, and which of them ought to be learned by several individuals, by the individuals who are there, and to what extent they should be learned." So Aristotle proves here that political science does have an architectonic character. Political science ordains or directs all of the other sciences. Which sciences are needed by a community? Political science determines who should learn what disciplines. Political science decides how extensively each science should be developed. All of these decisions require great wisdom about how different goods, at all different levels of the hierarchy of goods, how they all contribute to the overall welfare of a human community, to the common good of the community, demonstrating coordination of all of the different parts of society, all of the different sciences, all toward the common good. He goes on to say, quote, "We likewise see that the most honorable of the powers or faculties are arranged under this power. For instance, the military power, the economical power, the rhetorical powers, all of these," he says, "are arranged under and are directed by political science." So even if we consider what are the most prestigious sciences, military science, economics, we could say medicine, rhetoric, and so on, the most prestigious sciences, they're all subject to political science. They're all arranged under or are subordinate to political science. Military science, he names as an example, which studies warfare and defense. Economic science, which studies the management of resources that are available to a community. Rhetorical science, which studies persuasive speech. All of these are honorable sciences, prestigious sciences, because they address fundamental needs that require excellence. But political science determines how all of these are to be studied properly, determines their proper direction. Political science determines whether or not war is just. Political science determines what wealth is available in a nation to serve the common good. Political science determines how rhetoric should serve truth rather than manipulation. Think of how the rhetorical art is used in a society, whether it's good or bad, how children are educated to become competent in the rhetorical art. All of that depends on the working out of a clear political science. So again, political science is proven here to be the most honorable of all of the sciences. Aristotle continues and says, since, however, the remaining practical sciences use this political science, and since it also legally establishes what ought to be done and from what it is requisite to abstain, the end of this science will comprehend in itself the ends of the other sciences, so that this will be human good itself. Aristotle gives us two final arguments to prove the supremacy of political science. First, he says that other practical sciences use political science for guidance about their role in the community. Other sciences look to political science for direction. Secondly, political science legally establishes what should be done by the real-world law-making authority. Since political science guides other sciences and possesses legislative authority, political science's end comprehends. That means it includes all of, it encompasses all other sciences' ends. Let me repeat that last sentence. Because political science guides other sciences and possesses legislative authority, political science's end comprehends all other sciences' ends. Therefore, the goal of political science is human good itself, the complete good of human beings in community. Aristotle continues and writes, quote, "For though the good of an individual and the good of a city is the same, yet to obtain and preserve the good of a city appears to be something greater and more perfect." So Aristotle clarifies here that individual good and the common good are the same kind of good. That is, what's good for the individual is also good for everyone, and vice versa. Both of these, both individual good and the common good, involve virtue, happiness, and human prosperity. A truly good city promotes the same excellence that makes an individual virtuous. But the good of the city is greater and more perfect because it extends to more people and is more complete and is more self-sufficient, enabling fuller human development than isolated individual life. And we'll often hear things like this. We'll hear people say things like, we can accomplish much more working together than any of us can accomplish on our own. And that's true. Just think about how society works. We don't all do the work that provides for the basic necessities of life. We don't all work to grow grain that's used to make our daily bread. We don't all do the most basic and fundamental work in society. Our society provides for basic things to be taken care of, and often they're already well established and we don't even think about them. And that frees us. That frees us as a community and as individuals to pursue things that we would not be able to pursue if we lived on our own. If we lived on our own, we'd be spending all of our time trying to figure out how we're going to get food or how we're going to clothe ourselves, where we're going to live, and so on. When we turn our attention to the common good and seek to order an entire community, when the community begins to become ordered, what happens is the quality of life improves for everyone in the community. So the quality of life improves for everyone. It frees us to pursue higher things. Man, after all, if we think about our nature as rational creatures, man wasn't created to plow fields. He wasn't created to simply grow vegetables and raise animals. He was created for something much more noble than just working to provide for his basic bodily needs. He was made to create something that is intelligent and eternal, just like man himself. And when a community lives together and shares all of its gifts and all of its resources, all of its work, that community begins to flourish and enjoys a quality of life that wouldn't be possible if we lived in isolation. So the city's good, the good of the city, is greater and more perfect because it extends to more people, is more complete, and is self-sufficient, and, as I mentioned, enables fuller human development or higher quality of life than isolated individual life allows. Aristotle says, quote, "We must be satisfied indeed if we can effect the good of an individual alone. But it is more beautiful and divine to effect the good of a nation and cities." He says it's good to help one person become good, but it's just obviously better if we're able to lift up a whole community of people and help a whole community of people to enjoy happiness. So he acknowledges the genuine value in individual good, but he emphasizes the superior excellence of the common good. Working for the prosperity and happiness of a community is more beautiful than individual prosperity or happiness because it involves greater harmony and completeness. It's more divine because it resembles God's providential care and God's will for all creation. Think about it in terms of musical instruments. We can say that the music of a trumpet is nice to listen to. Maybe some people wouldn't agree with that, but the music of any individual instrument can be pleasant to listen to. But it can't compare to the harmony that's produced by an orchestra. When we have different instruments playing together, or even the same instrument playing with other instruments, we're able to produce harmony. We can't produce harmony alone. So that would be a good question for us, thinking of music. What's more beautiful? Melody? A nice melody where one voice or one instrument plays, or harmony? Which is superior? Which is more excellent? I think everyone would agree that harmony is more excellent than melody. Even though melody is pleasant and good, harmony is better. And so that's what it means here when Aristotle says that the flourishing of a whole community is more beautiful because it involves greater harmony and completeness. It's like an orchestra with all these different parts all working together for the benefit of all of the members of the community. We see this taught in the scriptures where the church is compared to a body, and St. Paul teaches that just as a body is made up of all of these different parts, the body can't flourish unless all of the parts are working together. The eye, as great as it may be by itself, isn't nearly as valuable or useful as when it's united to all the other parts of the body and they're all working together. So the flourishing of a community is more beautiful than the flourishing of one individual because it involves greater harmony and completeness. He also says it's more divine because the well-ordered city is more completely in line with God's will. It does what God intends to do. Think of when God created the world. He made all of these different parts of nature. He made all these different plants and animals, birds of the air, fishes of the seas, and he looked at all of them designed to live in prosperity together, to live in harmony. He created the whole natural world, the whole system of life, and he looked at it, and what did he say? He said, "Behold, it is very good." That's the idea of the prosperity of a city being more divine than the prosperity of an individual. And again, this doesn't diminish individual dignity or individual happiness. It doesn't say that that's not important. But it shows that individual good is a part of the good of a community. Individual good finds completion with the good of other individuals all joined together in community. That must be the ultimate good, the prosperity and happiness of the whole community. Aristotle then wraps up this chapter and writes, "These are the things, therefore, which the method, being political, requires." These are the things, therefore, which the method, being political, requires. So Aristotle establishes here in this second chapter his methodological framework, how he's going to go about this investigation. He says the method being political. That means that throughout the ethics, Aristotle is going to examine virtue and happiness as they relate to community life. That's going to be the method being political, not individual or monastic. Monastic means individual. Not individual, but political. So we're going to consider virtue and happiness as they relate to the life of the entire human community. This political method, and I hope you see what's meant by political. The idea, the Greek word polis refers to the city or the state, the whole community. A political method is a method that considers the good of the whole community. It considers how individual virtue contributes to the common good and how good institutions help to develop virtue. What the real purpose of government is, for example. It's to develop virtue, recognizing that humans achieve their highest potential. Humans fulfill their potential and really become what God intends for them to be through well-ordered community participation. So we read Aristotle writing this 350 years before Christ, and we have to wonder, could he ever have imagined what Christ would establish in the Catholic Church, which would fill the whole world, which would bring the love of Christ and all of the gifts of the Holy Spirit to every city on earth? There's no way that Aristotle, even though he has everything so right about human happiness, there's no way that he could have imagined what would be established 350 years later, or really closer to 380 years later, when our Lord established the Catholic Church, which would go on to take over the whole world and continue to extend itself today. Currently, it's made up of 1.4 billion people. Aristotle could never have even imagined what God intended to produce in and through the Catholic Church, which his teaching would one day become a crucial part of. It's amazing to think about how Aristotle, by studying and reasoning, came to the knowledge of the truth, morally speaking, and his effort, his investigation, became a part of the life of the Church when it was embraced by St. Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic philosophers, and became the source of true Christian philosophy. It's pretty awesome to think of the reality that Aristotle contributed and participated in the development of the Church, which fulfills the idea that he had of what true human happiness would consist of. Amazing to think about. There's a painting I'd like to mention before I wrap up here. It just came to mind. I just remembered it. There's a painting by the famous artist Raphael. I think it's titled Disputation Over the Eucharist. I think that's what it's titled. It's a beautiful, very colorful painting, and it's a disputation over the Eucharist. So it's like all of the wise men of the Church and of the world discussing the Eucharist and understanding this ultimate mystery that was revealed to the Church through Christ. And if you find that painting, you can find it online. It's very easy, very popular. It's Raphael's Disputation Over the Eucharist. And you'll see all of these different men illustrated by Raphael in the painting. And I challenge you to try to figure out who's who all the people are. But in that painting, very interestingly, in that painting, the Disputation Over the Eucharist, you can find, if you look carefully, you can find Aristotle included in that painting. It's very interesting to take a look at. Thomas Aquinas is in that painting. All the great church fathers, the apostles and prophets are in that painting. Many saints are in that painting. Dante, the famous poet of the 14th century, he's in that painting. Very beautiful, very, very meaningful and interesting painting to look at. But most importantly, Aristotle is in that painting, and this is why, part of the reason why. So that brings us to the end of our interpretation of this lesson, chapter 2. Having gone through all of that, let me give you a number of points that sum up the key topics in the lesson that you can actually commit to memory if you'd like to. I'll give you 10 points that are worthy of memorization. Number 1, human actions require one final end, desired for its own sake, to avoid infinite regress, or just a life that has no purpose. Human actions require one final end, desired for its own sake, to avoid infinite regress. And you can go back and read part 1 for the proof of that point. Number 2, knowledge of the highest good is practically necessary for right living, like archers need targets. Knowledge of the highest good is practically necessary for right living, like archers need targets. Number 3, political science is the most principal and architectonic science governing other practical sciences. Political science is the most principal and architectonic science governing other practical sciences. Number 4, political science ordains what sciences exist in cities and determines their proper extent. Political science ordains what sciences exist in cities and determines their proper extent. Number 5, military, economic, and rhetorical sciences are arranged under political sciences' authority. Military, economic, and rhetorical sciences are arranged under political science's authority. Number 6, political science's end comprehends all other sciences' ends and is human good itself. Political science's end comprehends all other sciences' ends and is human good itself. Number 7, individual good and city's good are the same kind, but the city's good is greater and more perfect. Individual good and a city's good are the same kind, but the city's good is greater and more perfect. Number 8, working for the common good is more beautiful and divine than individual good alone. Working for the common good is more beautiful and divine than individual good alone. And a quick note on that, when we say that working for the common good is more divine, just think about it. Christ lived in the presence of God the Father in heaven by himself. He chose to become a man. He chose to be incarnate in order to seek the good of all men. So Christ's incarnation is an example of working for the common good, and that work being more divine, more godlike, than working for the good of an individual alone. Number 9, the political method studies virtue and happiness in relation to community life. The political method studies virtue and happiness in relation to community life. And number 10, ethics must be practical, aiming at achieving the good in human community. Ethics must be practical, aiming at achieving the good in human community. Those are our 10 points that I think are worthy of memorization to really master the content of chapter 2. So let's bring this lesson to a close. In this lesson, we've studied chapter 2 of book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We've examined Aristotle's demonstration or proof that political science is the architectonic science, studying the highest good. We've studied Aristotle's argument for the necessity of a final end. And we've also studied the relationship between individual and common good. These were the main ideas or themes of chapter 2. So having gone through all of this together, now it's time for you as a student to reread the lesson, to study the lesson thoroughly for yourself, to develop your understanding of the lesson, and to demonstrate your understanding by completing the graded assessments that are provided in the lesson. If you have any questions, please visit the Academy Help Center, which you can reach if you go to classicalliberalarts.com/support. classicalliberalarts.com/support. Once again, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that this lesson has been helpful. God bless your studies.